Okay, fifth grade, for Tuesday's reading, we got abruptly cut off, and apparently you can only go so long on YouTubing yourself, and then it cuts you off. So I'm going to have to back up to page 28, or we're going to turn to page 28, and I'm going to go to the second full paragraph so we can all start there together, and we'll probably be reading a little bit about what we did on Tuesday. I'm busy with Daddy working out his family tree. As we go along, he tells me little bits about everyone. It's terribly interesting. Mr. Kufas brings us a few special books. He brings a few special books for me every other week. I'm thrilled with the Hoop de Hule series. I've enjoyed the whole of Sissy van Markveld so much, and I've read In Zoomerthug 4 times and still laugh about some of the ludicrous situations that arise. Remember, we said that big word? Ludicrous means something like weird or funny or you can't believe it. So if you have a dictionary or you can search for it on your computer, look up that word and write it down in your spiral that we're keeping for this book and write down a definition for it. I know some of you may not can do that, but if you can, do that for me. Term time has begun again. I'm working hard at my French and managed to pump in 5 irregular verbs per day. Peter sighs and groans over his English. A few school books have just arrived. We have a good stock of exercise books, pencils, rubbers, and labels, as I brought these with me. I sometimes listen to the Dutch news from London. Heard Prince Bernard recently. He said that Princess Juliana is expecting a baby about next January. I think it is lovely. It surprises the others that I should be so keen on the royal family. I was being discussed, and they decided that I'm not completely stupid after all, which had the effect of making me work extra hard the next day. I certainly don't want to be still in the first term or the first form when I'm 14 or 15. Also, the fact that I'm hardly allowed to read any decent books was mentioned. Mummy is reading Hurin Vaughan and Nocton now, which I'm not allowed to. Marga is. Remember, that's her sister that's a couple of years older than her. First, I must be more developed, like my talented sister. Then we talk about my ignorance of philosophy and psychology, about which I know nothing. Perhaps by next year I shall be wiser. I looked up these difficult words quickly in Conan. I have just woken up to the disturbing fact that I have 1 long-sleeve dress and 3 cardigans for the winter. I received permission from Daddy to knit a jumper of white sheep's wool. It's not very nice wool, but as long as it's warm, that's all that matters. We have some clothes deposited with friends, but unfortunately we shall not see them until after the war. That is, if they are still there then. I had just written something about Mrs. Von Don when in she came. Slap! I closed the book. Hey, Annie, can't I just have a look? I'm afraid not. Just the last page, then? No, I'm sorry. Naturally, it gave me a frightful shock because there was an unflattering description of her on this particular page. Yours, Annie. Friday, September the 25th, 1942. Dear Kitty, yesterday evening, I went upstairs and visited the Von Dons. I do so occasionally to have a chat. Sometimes it can be quite fun. Then we have some moth biscuits. The biscuit tin is kept in the wardrobe, which is full of mothballs, and drink lemonade. Okay, in this time, in this area, they were calling them biscuits, but what I imagine it is like some sort of cookie. Okay, and people put mothballs in their clothes when they store them to keep moths from coming in and eating holes in their clothes. And since these people had to store their clothes perhaps for a long time, they were keeping mothballs there. And if you've ever smelt a mothball smell, it's a very distinctive smell. So they stored their cookies in that same area, and they picked up, sometimes if you, a taste like the mothballs, sometimes if you put an onion next to something else, it kind of absorbs that taste, and then it tastes like an onion when you're not expecting it to. We talk about Peter. I told him how Peter often strokes my cheek, and that I wished he wouldn't, as I don't like being pawed by boys. In a typical way parents have, They asked if I couldn't get fond of Peter because he certainly liked me very much. I thought, oh dear, and said, oh no, imagine it. I did say that I thought Peter rather awkward, but that it was probably shyness, as many boys who haven't had much to do with girls are like that. I must say that the refuge committee of the secret annex, the male section, is very ingenious. I'll tell you what they've done now to get news of us through to Mr. Van Dyke, Travis's chief representative and a friend who has, that word is surreptitiously hidden some of our things for us, so he's done it very sneakily. They typed a letter to a chemist in South Zealand who does business with our firm in such a way that he has to send an enclosed reply back in an addressed envelope. Daddy addressed the envelope to the office. When this envelope arrives from Zealand, the enclosed letter is taken out and is replaced by a message in Daddy's handwriting as a sign of life. Like this, Van Dijk won't become suspicious when he reads the note. They specially chose Zealand because it is so close to Belgium and the letter could have easily been smuggled over the border. In addition, no one is allowed into Zealand without a special permit, so if they thought we were there, he couldn't try and look us up. Yours, Annie. I wish you could get to a map of that area and look and see where Belgium is in relationship to Germany. If you could do that, pull one up on, Google it and see if you can find a map of Germany and Belgium together so you can see kind of how close they are to each other. Sunday, the 27th of September, 1942. Dear Kitty, just had a big bust-up with Mummy for the umpteenth time. We simply don't get on together these days, and Margot and us don't hit it off any too well either. As a rule, we don't go in for such outbursts as this in our family. Still, it's by no means always pleasant for me. Margot's and Mummy's natures are completely strange to me. I can understand my friends better than my own mother. Too bad. We often discuss post-war problems. For example, how one ought to address servants. Post-war, that the post would mean after the war, because remember, pre is before. So post-war, we were talking about what's going to happen after the war. Mrs. Van Don had another tantrum. She is terribly moody. She keeps hiding more of her private belongings. Mummy ought to answer each Van Don disappearance with a frank disappearance. So see, Miss Van Don, like she may say, well, I can't find my plates, so we can't use them. And Anne Frank is saying that when she does that, her mother ought to say, oh, well, I can't find my cups and saucers, so we can't use them. All right, how some people do adore bringing up other people's children in addition to their own. Like sometimes you have some relatives maybe, or your parents have friends that think they know what should be done with you as you're being raised, and they might even share with your parents about, well, I think you should try this. Anyway, the Van Dons are that kind. Margot doesn't need it. She is such a goody-goody, perfection itself. But I seem to have enough mischief in me for the two of us put together. You should hear us at mealtimes with reprimands and cheeky answers flying to and fro. Mummy and Daddy always defend me stoutly. I'd have to give up if it weren't for them. Although they do tell me that I mustn't talk so much, that I must be more retiring and not poke my nose into everything, still I seem doomed to failure. If Daddy wasn't so patient, I'd be afraid I was going to turn out to be a terrific disappointment to my parents, and they are pretty lenient with me. They're pretty easygoing with her. If I take a small helping of some vegetable I detest and make up with potatoes, the Van Dons and Mevril in particular can't get over it that any child should be so spoiled. Come along, Annie, have a few more vegetables, she says straight away. No, thank you, Mrs. Van Don, I answer. I have plenty of potatoes. Vegetables are good for you. Your mother says so too. Have a few more, she says, pressing them on me until Daddy comes to my rescue. Then we have from Mrs. Van Don. You ought to have been in our home when we were properly brought up. It's absurd that Annie's so frightfully spoiled. I wouldn't put up with it if Annie were my daughter. These are always her first and last words. If Annie were my daughter. Thank heavens I'm not. But to come back to this upbringing business, there was a deadly silence after Mrs. Van Don had finished speaking yesterday. Then Daddy said, I think Annie is extremely well brought up. She has learned one thing anyway, and that is to make no reply to your long sermons. As to the vegetables, look at your own plate. Mrs. Van Don was beaten, well and truly beaten. She had taken a minute helping of vegetables herself. Remember, minute gets spelled the same way as minute, but in this sentence it's minute and it means tiny. But she is not spoiled. Oh no, too many vegetables in the evening make her constipated. I wish I could see all your faces as we read that. Why on earth doesn't she keep her mouth shut about me? Then she wouldn't need to make such feeble excuses. It's gorgeous the way Mrs. Van Don blushes. I don't. And that is just what she hates. She's saying, I don't blush like that when I'm embarrassed. Yours, Annie. Monday, September the 28th, 1942. Dear Kitty, I had to stop yesterday long before I'd finished. I just must tell you about another quarrel, but before I start on that, something else. Why do grown-ups quarrel so easily, so much, and over the most idiotic things? Up till now, I thought that only children squabbled, and that wore off as you grew up. Of course, there is sometimes a real reason for a quarrel, but this is just plain bickering. I suppose I should get used to it, but I can't, nor do I think I shall, as long as I am the subject of every discussion. They use the word discussion instead of quarrel. Nothing, I repeat, nothing is right about me is right. My general appearance, my character, my manners are discussed from A to Z. I'm expected, by order, to simply swallow all the harsh words and shouts in silence, and I'm not used to this. In fact, I can't. I'm not going to take all these insults lying down. I'll show them that Annie Frank wasn't born yesterday. Then they'll be surprised, and perhaps they'll keep their mouths shut when I let them see that I'm going to start educating them. Shall I take up that attitude? Plain barbarism. I'm simply amazed again and again over their awful manners, and especially stupidity. That of Mrs. Van Don's. But as soon as I get used to this, and it won't be long, then I'll give them some of their own back, and no half measures. Then they'll change their tunes. Am I really so bad-mannered, conceited, headstrong, pushing, stupid, lazy, etc., as they all say? Oh, of course not. I have my faults just like everyone else. I know that, but they thoroughly exaggerate everything. Kitty, if only you knew how I sometimes boil under so many jibes and jeers, and I don't know how long I shall be able to stifle my rage. I shall just blow up one day. Still, no more of this. I've bored you long enough with all these quarrels. But I simply must tell you of one highly interesting discussion at table. Somehow or another, we got on to the subject of Pim's, Daddy's nickname, extreme modesty. Even the most stupid people have to admit this about Daddy. Suddenly, Mrs. Van Don says, I, too, have an unassuming nature, more so than my husband. Did you ever? This sentence in itself shows quite clearly how thoroughly forward and pushing she is. Like when someone's forward, like they try to take charge maybe and say things they shouldn't, okay? And give their opinions freely, sounds like Mrs. Van Don does. Mr. Van Don thought he ought to give an explanation regarding the reference to himself. I don't wish to be modest. In my experience, it does not pay. Then to me, take my advice, Annie. Don't be too unassuming. It doesn't get you anywhere. Mummy agreed with this too, but Mrs. Van Don had to add, as always, her ideas on the subject. Her next remark was addressed to Mummy and Daddy. You have a strange outlook on life. Fancy saying such a thing to Annie. It was very different when I was young, and I felt sure that it still is, except in your modern home. This was a direct hit at the way Mummy brings up her daughters. Mrs. Van Don was scarlet by this time. Mummy, calm and cool as a cucumber. People who blush get so hot and excited It is quite a handicap in such a situation. Mummy, still entirely unruffled, but anxious to close the conversation as soon as possible, thought for a second and then said, I find too, Mrs. Van Don, that one gets on better in life if one is not over-modest. My husband now and Margaret and Peter are exceptionally modest, where your husband, Annie, you and I, though not exactly the opposite, don't allow ourselves to be completely pushed to one side. Mrs. Van Don, but Mrs. Frank, I don't understand you. I'm so very modest and retiring. How can you think of calling me anything else? Mummy, I did not say you were exactly forward, but no one could say you have a retiring disposition. So a retiring disposition would be the opposite of being overbearing. It would be someone who doesn't try to take care of other people's business. And it kind of looks like Mrs. Van Don does, doesn't it? Mrs. Van Don, let us get this matter cleared up once and for all. I'd like to know in what way am I pushing. I know one thing. If I didn't look after myself, I'd soon be starving. This absurd remark in self-defense just made Mummy rock with laughter. That irritated Mrs. Van Don, who added a string of Dutch-German expressions until she became completely tongue-tied. Then she rose from her chair and was about to leave the room. Doesn't sound like she was happy, does it? Suddenly, her eye fell on me. You should have seen her. Unfortunately, at the very moment that she turned round, I was shaking my head sorrowfully. Not on purpose, but quite involuntary, for I had been following the whole conversation so closely. Mrs. Van Don turned round and began to reel off a lot of harsh German, common and ill-mannered, just like a coarse, red-faced fishwife. It was a marvelous sight. If I could draw, I'd have liked to catch her like this. It was a scream, such stupid, foolish little person. Anyhow, I've learned one thing now. You only really get to know people when you've had a jolly good row with them. Then, in a jolly good row would be an argument or a fight. Then and only then can you judge their true characters. So, how do you think it's going for Annie, being in hiding with another family? You can see there's a lot of difficulties. All right, next entry, Tuesday, the 29th of September, 1942. Dear Kitty, extraordinary things can happen to people who go into hiding. Just imagine, as there is no bath, we use a wash tub, and because there is no hot water in the office, by which I always mean the whole of the lower floor, all 7 of us take it in turns to make use of this great luxury, because there is hot water in the office. But because we are so different and some are more modest than others, each member of the family has found his own place for carrying out the performance. Peter uses the kitchen in spite of its glass doors. When he is going to have a bath, he goes to each one of us in turn and tells us that we must not walk past the kitchen for half an hour. He seems to think this is sufficient. Mr. Van Don goes right upstairs. To him it is worth the bother of carrying hot water all that way so as to have the seclusion of his own room. Mrs. Van Don simply doesn't bathe at all at present. She is just waiting to see which is the best place. Oh, goodness, I wonder how long she went without a bath. Daddy has his bath in the private office. Mummy chose behind a fire guard in the kitchen. Margot and I have chosen the front office for our scrub. The curtains there are drawn on Saturday afternoons, so we wash ourselves in semi-darkness. However, I don't like this place any longer, and since last week, I've been on the lookout for more comfortable quarters. Peter gave me the idea, and that was to try the large office WC. Remember, that's the water closet. It's like a form of the bathroom. I guess it doesn't have a bathtub, but perhaps a toilet. There I can sit down, have the light on, lock the door, pour my own bath water away, and I'm safe from prying eyes. I tried my beautiful bathroom on Sunday for the first time, and although it sounds mad, I think it is the best place of all. Last week, the plumber was at work downstairs to move the drains and water pipes from the office WC to the passage. This change is a precaution against frozen pipes in case we should have a cold winter. The plumber's visit was by far from pleasant for us. Not only were we unable to draw water the whole day, but we could not go to the WC either. Now, it is rather indecent to tell you what we did to overcome this difficulty. However, I'm not such a prude that I can't talk about these things. The day we arrived here, Daddy and I improvised a potty for ourselves. Not having a better receptacle, we sacrificed a glass preserving jar for this purpose. Some of your parents may have, or your moms and grandmothers may have jars that they can vegetables in, so that would be a preserving jar. During the plumber's visit, nature's offerings were deposited in these jars in the sitting room during the day. I don't think this was nearly as bad as having to sit still and not talk the whole day. You can imagine what a trial that was for Miss Quack Quack. I have to whisper on ordinary days, but not being able to speak or move was 10 times worse. After being flattened by 3 days of continuous sitting, my bottom was very stiff and painful. Some exercises at bedtime helped. Yours, Annie. Can you imagine all the things that she had to go through as she was in hiding? But remember, they were hiding so that they wouldn't be found and taken away to a concentration camp where many, many, many people were killed. Thursday, October 1st, 1942. Dear Kitty, I got a terrible shock yesterday. Suddenly at 8 o'clock, the bell rang loudly. Of course, I thought that someone had come. You'll guess who I mean. But I calmed down a bit when everyone said it must be some urchins or perhaps the postman. The days are becoming very quiet here. Lewin, a small Jewish chemist and dispenser, works for Mr. Kraler in the kitchen. He knows the whole building well, and therefore we are always afraid that he'll take it into his head to have a peep in the old laboratory. We are as quiet as mice. Who 3 months ago would have ever guessed that Quicksilver Annie would have to sit still for hours, and what's more, could? The 29th was Mrs. Van Don's birthday. Although it would not be celebrated in a big way, we managed a little party in her honor with a specially nice meal, and she received some small presents and flowers. Red carnations from her husband. That seems to be a family tradition. To pause for a moment on the subject of Mrs. Van Don, I must tell you that her attempts to flirt with Daddy are a source of continual irritation for me. She strokes his face and hair, pulls her skirt right up, and makes so-called witty remarks, trying in this way to attract Pim's attention. Remember, that's her dad. Pim, thank goodness, doesn't find her either attractive or funny, so he doesn't play ball. Mummy doesn't behave like that with Mr. Van Don. I've said that to Mrs. Van Don's face. Now and then, Peter comes out of his shell and can be quite funny. We have one thing in common from which everyone usually gets a bit of amusement. We both like dressing up. He appeared in one of Mrs. Van Don's very narrow dresses, and I put on his suit. He wore a hat and I a cap. The grown-ups were doubled up with laughter, and we enjoyed ourselves as much as they did. Eli has bought new skirts for Margot and me at Bienenkorf's. The material is rotten, just like sacking, and they cost 24 florins and 7.50 florins respectively. What a difference compared with before the war. So apparently it was very hard. They couldn't get things, even if you were out in among the free world where you could roam around and buy stuff. Another nice thing that I've been keeping up my sleeve, Ellie has written to some secretarial school or another and ordered correspondence course in shorthand for Margot, Peter, and me. You wait and see what perfect experts we shall be by next year. In any case, it's extremely important to be able to write in a code. Yours, Annie. I think I'm going to stop there because I think it cut me off at about 27 minutes yesterday, and we're at 24, and I don't want to be stopped in the middle of a passage. So I'll stop here and upload this, get it onto the Google Classroom with the help of Thad's mother probably, and then we'll start with the next reading. This is Wednesdays. The next reading will be Thursdays. I'd like for y'all maybe to just get in GroupMe sometime or just text me on my number and say what you're thinking about your third day of reading out of this book? Is it interesting? Are you anxious to find out what happens? Anything that you think about that I would be interested in. All right, and I'm going to flip the camera around and say a quick hi to you before I close off, okay?